It was a quiet evening in the small, close-knit neighborhood of Greenfield, the kind of place where kids played outside until the streetlights flickered on and everyone knew each other's names. The hum of life was steady and familiar, a comfort in its own way. But on this particular evening, something happened that would change everything. Officer Marcus Reed had been patrolling these streets for years. To him, Greenfield was more than just a beat, it was home. He prided himself on knowing the community, on being the cop who could bridge the gap between the badge and the people. But that night, a call came through his radio that sent a chill down his spine, a report of a possible armed suspect in the area. Marcus's heart raced as he drove toward the location. The description was vague, just a young male in dark clothing. The weight of responsibility pressed heavy on his chest. In the dim light of dusk, shadows danced across the sidewalks, making it harder to discern what was real and what was imagined. Then he saw him. A boy, no older than 12, standing alone near the corner store. His small frame was hunched over something, though it was hard to tell what. Marcus stopped his car, his pulse quickening. Adrenaline kicked in, clouding his better judgment. He stepped out, his voice firm but not unkind. "Hey kid, what are you doing out here?" The boy froze, startled, and turned to face him. In his hands was a shiny object. Was it a weapon? The air between them felt electric, heavy with tension. Marcus called out again, his voice more urgent this time. "Drop it, now." What happened next would replay in Marcus's mind over and over again. The boy's hand twitched, and Marcus reacted instinctively, his training taking over. The sound of the gunshot pierced the night, shattering the fragile calm. The boy fell to the ground, and time seemed to stop. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he rushed forward, his heart pounding harder than ever before. But as he reached the boy, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The object in the boy's hand wasn't a weapon at all, it was just a toy. A small plastic car, gleaming in the faint light. In that moment, Marcus felt the world collapse around him. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a tidal wave. He looked at the boy, his face pale and still, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took his breath away. But then something happened that Marcus couldn't explain, something that defied logic and reason. Just 5 minutes later, as he knelt there, cradling the boy's small, fragile body, he saw something that made him question everything he thought he knew. What Marcus discovered in those next moments would not only turn his world upside down, but reveal a truth far deeper and more complex than he could have ever imagined. Stay with me as we unravel the story of a single, life-altering decision, the ripple effects it set in motion, and the unexpected twist that left everyone stunned. This is a story about choices, humanity, and the unshakable power of truth. You won't believe what happens next. Would you like me to continue or adjust anything? Marcus felt frozen in time as he cradled the boy in his arms. His mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. The flash of movement, the gleam of the toy, the split-second decision he made, it all felt surreal, like a terrible dream he couldn't wake up from. Around him, the world seemed to blur. The faint hum of passing cars, distant voices, the buzz of a street lamp, it all faded into the background. His hands trembled as he gently laid the boy down on the ground. The child's face was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like he was merely asleep. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of guilt pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He fumbled for his radio, barely able to find his voice. "Dispatch, I need an ambulance." "Now," he choked out, his voice breaking. The moments that followed were a haze. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. Their faces were a mix of confusion, fear, and anger. A woman screamed, clutching her chest, while others whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Marcus and the boy. "Is he okay?" someone shouted. "What happened?" another voice demanded. Marcus couldn't respond. He couldn't even look at them. His focus was on the boy, on the tiny rise and fall of his chest. He was still breathing, but barely. Blood seeped from his shoulder, staining his small t-shirt. Marcus pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, his mind racing with regret. How could this have happened? How had he misjudged the situation so completely? He'd prided himself on being level-headed, on thinking things through, on always doing the right thing. But in that moment he had failed the boy, failed the community, and failed himself. As the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, Marcus's thoughts began to spiral. Who was this boy? Where had he come from? Why was he out here alone at this hour? And what was he doing with that toy? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no answers, only a gnawing sense of dread. Then, something strange caught Marcus's eye. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The boy's hand, where the toy car had been, seemed to twitch. Marcus blinked, unsure if he had imagined it. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. Hey, kid, he said softly, his voice trembling. Can you hear me? The boy's eyelids fluttered, just for a moment, and then he was still again. Marcus's heart leaped. Was he waking up? Was he trying to say something? The questions only added to the storm of emotions raging inside him. By the time the paramedics arrived, Marcus was barely holding himself together. They worked quickly, lifting the boy onto a stretcher and rushing him to the ambulance. Marcus stood there, feeling helpless, as the vehicle sped away, its lights flashing against the darkening sky. A fellow officer arrived on the scene shortly after, a stern look on his face. It was Officer Jenna Morales, someone Marcus had worked with for years. She approached him cautiously, her eyes scanning the scene. Marcus, what happened here? She asked, her voice low but firm. Marcus hesitated, the words catching in his throat. How could he explain what he had done? How could he make her understand the split-second fear, the mistake that had led to this moment? I thought he had a weapon, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was dark. I didn't see the toy until it was too late. Jenna's expression softened, but there was still a hint of disbelief in her eyes. We'll figure this out, she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. But you need to tell me everything, every detail. As Marcus recounted the events, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he understood. The boy's sudden appearance, the strange twitch of his hand, the way the air seemed to shift around him. It all felt off, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was alive with whispers. People gathered in small groups, their voices hushed but urgent. Word of the incident spread quickly, and with it came speculation, rumors, and a growing sense of unease. Did you hear? A cop shot a kid. They're saying it was an accident, but who knows? That boy, he's from the old Johnson house, isn't he? The mention of the Johnson house sent a chill down Marcus's spine. The house had a reputation, a dark history that the locals rarely spoke of. It had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, its yard overgrown. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was cursed. But whatever the truth, it was a place no one dared to go near, especially not a child. Why had the boy been near that house? And what had he been doing with that toy? The questions gnawed at Marcus, each one more unsettling than the last. Later that night, as Marcus sat alone in his car, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him, his phone buzzed. It was Jenna. We found something, she said, her voice tense. You need to come down to the station. Marcus's heart sank. What could they have found? And why did Jenna sound so shaken? He started the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, and drove toward the station, the pit in his stomach growing with each passing mile. As he pulled into the parking lot, Marcus felt a strange sense of foreboding. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, it would only deepen the mystery surrounding the boy. And he was right. What Jenna showed him would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew, about the boy, about that night, and about himself. But that revelation is only the beginning of this story. The truth is far more complex, far more chilling than Marcus could have ever imagined. Would you like me to continue or refine this section in any way? Marcus walked into the station, his chest tight with unease. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher than usual, casting long, unforgiving shadows across the room. Jenna was waiting for him near her desk, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her expression was unreadable, but the tension in her posture was clear. "I don't know how to explain this," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "But you need to see it for yourself." She handed him the folder, and Marcus opened it with trembling hands. Inside were a series of photographs taken from the scene, standard procedure for any incident involving an officer. At first glance, everything seemed normal. There was the boy, the toy car, the blood on the pavement. But then Marcus's eyes landed on something that made his stomach drop. In one of the photos, taken just moments after the shooting, there was a faint figure in the background. It was blurry, almost transparent, but unmistakably human. The figure appeared to be watching from the shadows, standing near the old Johnson house. Marcus's pulse quickened as he stared at the image. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenna shook her head. "We don't know." None of the witnesses mentioned seeing anyone else at the scene, and the area was clear when backup arrived. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The figure in the photo didn't make sense, and yet there it was, plain as day. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the boy somehow, though he had no idea how or why. "Did you run any background on the boy?" Marcus asked, trying to steady his voice. Jenna nodded, her expression grim. "That's the other thing. His name is Elijah Carter. He's 10 years old, lives with his grandmother a few blocks from the Johnson house. But here's where it gets strange. She reported him missing 2 weeks ago." Marcus blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. 2 weeks? Then what was he doing out there tonight? Jenna hesitated before answering. "We don't know. But his grandmother mentioned something odd when we interviewed her. She said Elijah had been talking about a man in the shadows before he disappeared. She thought he was just making up stories. But now..." She trailed off, her eyes darting to the photo in Marcus's hands. The room seemed to grow colder as Marcus processed what Jenna was saying. A missing boy, a mysterious figure, and an abandoned house with a dark past. It all felt like something out of a nightmare. But this was real, and he was right in the middle of it. Later that night, Marcus couldn't shake the image of the figure from his mind. He decided to drive back to the scene, hoping to find some answers, or at least some semblance of clarity. The streets were eerily quiet as he approached the old Johnson house, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. He parked his car and stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy, thick with an almost unnatural stillness. Marcus's footsteps echoed as he approached the house, the wooden boards creaking beneath his weight. As he shone his light across the yard, something caught his eye, a faint glimmer near the base of the house. He crouched down, brushing away the overgrown weeds, and found a small metal object buried in the dirt. It was a locket, tarnished and old, with an engraving on the back, asterisk for Elijah asterisk. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photo of a woman holding a baby, both of them smiling. He recognized the woman as Elijah's grandmother, but the baby, could it be Elijah? And if so, how had the locket ended up here? As he stood there, clutching the locket, Marcus heard a faint sound behind him, a whisper, barely audible, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. He turned quickly, his flashlight sweeping across the yard, but there was no one there. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he realized he was no longer alone. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a soft, childlike voice answered, "You need to help him." Marcus spun around, his flashlight landing on the figure of a boy standing near the edge of the yard. It was Elijah, or at least it looked like him, but something about the boy was off. His eyes seemed too bright, his features too still, as if he were more shadow than substance. "Help who?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the Johnson house, his small hand shaking slightly. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, fading into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. Marcus stood there, his mind racing. Was he seeing things? Was his guilt playing tricks on him? Or was there something more to all of this, something he couldn't explain? As he turned back toward the house, a sense of resolve washed over him. Whatever was happening, he needed to get to the bottom of it. For Elijah, for the community, and for himself. But as he stepped closer to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows around him were alive with unseen eyes. The deeper Marcus went, the more questions he uncovered, and the fewer answers he found. And yet, he couldn't stop. Something was pulling him forward, drawing him into the heart of a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew. But the truth, when he finally found it, would be far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. Marcus took a deep breath, standing at the edge of the Johnson house's yard. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating, as though the house itself was alive and aware of his presence. He tightened his grip on the locket, his fingers trembling slightly, and took a cautious step forward. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to turn back, to leave this place and never return, but something stronger pulled him forward. He couldn't walk away, not when so many unanswered questions remained. The wooden steps creaked beneath his boots as he approached the front door. The faded paint was peeling away, revealing the rotted wood underneath. He reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. It felt wrong, like he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But then he remembered Elijah's face, pale and still in the ambulance, and the strange figure in the photograph. He needed answers. The door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust particles hung in the air, glinting faintly in the beam of Marcus's flashlight. The house smelled of mildew and decay, the scent clinging to the walls like an unspoken secret. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and pieces of old newspapers yellowed with age. "Hello," Marcus called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. It felt absurd to speak, but the silence was unbearable. His flashlight swept across the room, illuminating faded wallpaper and torn curtains that hung limply from rusted rods. The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Marcus froze, his heart pounding. The logical part of his mind told him it was just the house settling, that old wood creaked and shifted with time. But deep down he knew better. Someone, or something, was up there. He climbed the staircase slowly, each step groaning under his weight. The faint sound of whispers reached his ears, indistinct but undeniably present. Marcus strained to make out the words, but they were just out of reach, like a half-remembered dream. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in a long hallway lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but one at the far end was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. Marcus's breath quickened as he made his way toward it, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hands. The door creaked open as he pushed it gently, revealing what appeared to be a child's bedroom. The walls were painted a pale blue, adorned with faded star stickers that glowed faintly in the dark. A small bed sat in the corner, its covers rumpled and worn. On the floor, scattered toys lay abandoned, their bright colors dulled by a thick layer of dust. Marcus's eyes were drawn to the center of the room, where a large circular stain marred the wooden floorboards. It was dark, almost black, and it radiated an unsettling energy. He stepped closer, his flashlight trained on the stain. It was then that he noticed the faint markings etched into the wood around it, symbols and patterns he didn't recognize, but that made his skin crawl. A sudden noise behind him made Marcus whirl around, his flashlight sweeping the room. The door slammed shut, plunging him into darkness. His pulse raced as he fumbled for the doorknob, only to find it locked. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The whispers returned, louder this time, circling him like a storm. Marcus pressed his back against the wall, his flashlight flickering. In the faint, stuttering light, he saw shadows shifting and twisting, taking on shapes that defied explanation. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw him, Elijah. The boy stood in the corner of the room, his eyes wide and unblinking. His lips moved, but the words were drowned out by the deafening whispers. Marcus reached out toward him, desperate to make contact. "Elijah," he shouted, "it's okay. I'm here to help you." The boy's gaze shifted to the stain on the floor, his expression filled with a mix of fear and urgency. He raised a trembling hand and pointed to it, his mouth moving faster now, the whispers growing louder. Marcus knelt down, his hand hovering over the dark stain. "What is this?" he muttered, more to himself than to Elijah. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, a searing pain shot through his hand, traveling up his arm like fire. He cried out, pulling his hand back, but the sensation lingered, a burning heat that seemed to burrow into his very bones. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow worse. When Marcus looked up, Elijah was gone. The room was empty, the shadows retreating to their corners. He was alone, but the weight of the house pressed down on him, suffocating and oppressive. The doorknob turned easily now, and Marcus stumbled out into the hallway, his breathing ragged. He didn't know what he had just experienced, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. As he made his way back down the stairs, he felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, watching his every move. The house seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as if it were alive and aware of his intrusion. Marcus stepped outside, the cool night air a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the house. He leaned against his car, trying to steady his racing heart. In his hand, he still held the locket, its metal warm to the touch. Whatever was happening here, it was far bigger than he had imagined. Elijah wasn't just a boy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was the key to something much darker, something that Marcus couldn't yet comprehend. As he drove away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the photograph. But the road behind him was empty, stretching out into the darkness. The questions piled up in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. What had happened to Elijah during those 2 weeks he was missing? What was the meaning of the symbols in the house? And who, or what, was the figure in the photograph? Marcus knew he was running out of time. Whatever was happening, it was building to something, a breaking point he could feel but couldn't yet see. The answers were out there, waiting for him in the shadows. But the truth, he feared, might be more than he could handle. Marcus barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elijah's face, or what he thought was Elijah, standing in that dimly lit room, pointing to the stain on the floor. The whispers seemed to linger in his ears, even in the silence of his apartment. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. By morning, Marcus felt like a shadow of himself, but he knew he couldn't let exhaustion stop him. He had too many unanswered questions, and every moment that passed felt like another step further from the truth. He pulled out the locket again, examining it under the pale morning light. The inscription, "For Elijah," caught the sunlight, glinting faintly. It felt like a clue, but one he couldn't decipher. He decided to visit Elijah's grandmother. If anyone knew more about what had happened to the boy, it would be her. The drive to her house was tense, the streets still quiet in the early hours. Marcus parked outside a modest home with a sagging porch and overgrown lawn. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. An older woman answered, her face lined with worry and grief. She looked up at him with weary eyes that had likely cried too many tears in recent weeks. "You're the officer from the other night," she said, her voice heavy. "What do you want?" "I'm trying to understand what happened to Elijah," Marcus said gently. He held up the locket. "I found this. I thought it might mean something to you." Her hand flew to her chest as her eyes widened. "That was his mother's," she whispered. "I thought it was lost forever." She took the locket, her fingers trembling, and held it close. "Why do you have this?" "I found it near the old Johnson house," Marcus explained. "I think Elijah might have been trying to tell me something." Her expression darkened at the mention of the house. "That place has been nothing but trouble," she said, shaking her head. "Elijah used to talk about it, said he saw things there. I told him to stay away, but—" Her voice cracked, and she took a moment to compose herself. "He said a man in the shadows was calling to him, asking for help." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Did he ever say who the man was? She hesitated, her brow furrowing as she struggled to recall. Not by name, though, but he said the man was trapped, that he couldn't leave the house. Her eyes met Marcus's, and he saw the fear in them. Marcus thanked her and left, his mind racing. If Elijah had been drawn to the house by some unseen force, then maybe the whispers and shadows weren't just figments of his imagination. Maybe they were real. He decided to visit the town records office next, hoping to find more information about the Johnson house. The clerk, an older man with a knowing look, raised an eyebrow when Marcus mentioned the address. "That place," he said, shaking his head. "Nothing good's ever come out of there." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, leaning on the counter. The man sighed and pulled out a thick binder, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. It was built in the early 1900s by a man named Edward Johnson. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and every family that's lived there since has met with tragedy. Fires, illnesses, accidents, you name it. "Did anyone ever find out why?" Marcus asked, scanning the pages. The clerk shook his head. "Theories, sure. Some say the house is cursed. Others think it's built on some kind of ancient burial ground. All I know is, people avoid that place like the plague." Marcus's heart sank as he stared at an old photograph of Edward Johnson, a stern-looking man with piercing eyes. There was something unsettling about his gaze, as though he were looking directly at Marcus through the photograph. As he left the records office, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to something dangerous. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was dark and incomprehensible. That night, he returned to the Johnson house, armed with a renewed determination and a creeping sense of dread. He had barely stepped inside when the air seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent this time, as though the house itself were alive and angry. He climbed the stairs again, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The child's room was as he had left it, the faint glow of the star stickers the only source of light. But this time, the stain on the floor seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive. Marcus knelt down, his hand hovering over the stain. He didn't touch it this time, but he could feel the heat radiating from it. "What are you?" he whispered, more to himself than anything else. The whispers grew louder, forming words now, but they were fragmented and disjointed. He could make out phrases like "release him" and "he's waiting," but they made no sense. Marcus's heart pounded as he realized he wasn't alone in the room. He turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, a man, tall and shadowy, his features indistinct. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating. Marcus felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, its hand outstretched. Marcus scrambled backward, his flashlight flickering wildly. The figure pointed to the stain on the floor, its movements slow and deliberate. The whispers crescendoed, filling the room with an almost unbearable noise. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The figure was gone, and Marcus was left alone in the suffocating silence, the weight of the house pressing down on him. The stain on the floor pulsed one last time before going still. Marcus knew he couldn't keep doing this alone. Whatever was happening here was far beyond his understanding, and it was growing more dangerous by the moment. But as he left the house, one thing was clear: the shadows weren't just watching, they were waiting for him to make his next move. Marcus returned to the Johnson house one last time, his determination stronger than his fear. He couldn't ignore the pieces of the puzzle aligning: Elijah's connection to the house, the whispers, the shadowy figure, and the stain on the floor that seemed to pulse with an unholy energy. He brought a crowbar, a flashlight, and the locket, feeling absurdly unprepared for whatever awaited him. But he had no choice. The house was calling, and he knew he wouldn't find peace until he uncovered its truth. The night was unlovingly silent as he parked in front of the decrepit house. The air felt electric, humming with anticipation. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, his breath visible in the chill. He gripped the locket tightly, feeling its warmth in his palm. "For Elijah," he muttered under his breath, as though the words could ground him. Inside, the house was darker than before, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the light from his flashlight. Every step felt heavier, the wooden floor groaning beneath him like a warning. The whispers began almost immediately, faint at first, but growing louder as he made his way upstairs. This time, though, they weren't fragmented. They formed coherent words, shilling in their clarity. "Dig deeper. Release him." Marcus entered the child's room again, his heart pounding. The stain on the floor seemed larger now, its edges creeping outward like a spreading infection. He dropped to his knees, setting the flashlight beside him, and pressed the crowbar against the floorboards. With a sharp tug, the first plank came loose, revealing a dark void beneath. The whispers surged, nearly deafening, as Marcus pried up more boards. The smell of damp earth and decay hit him like a wave, and he coughed, trying to steady himself. Then he saw it, a small box, buried in the dirt. It was old and weathered, the wood warped and brittle. He hesitated for a moment, then reached for it, his hands shaking. As he lifted the box, the whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an eerie silence. Marcus opened the lid to find a bundle of letters, yellowed with age, and a small, intricately carved figurine. The letters were addressed to Edward Johnson, written in a delicate hand. Marcus unfolded the first one, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The letters told a story of betrayal and desperation. Edward Johnson had been involved in a dark ritual, seeking power and immortality. He had struck a deal with an unknown force, offering the soul of his only son in exchange. But when the time came, Edward couldn't go through with it. He buried the evidence, this box, and sealed the room, hoping to contain the curse. The last letter was a confession, filled with regret and fear. Edward begged for forgiveness, knowing he had doomed his family and the house to an eternity of torment. Marcus's blood ran cold. The shadowy figure he had seen wasn't a malevolent force. It was Edward, trapped by the very curse he had tried to stop. And the whispers weren't calling for vengeance. They were pleading for release. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and Marcus felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, clutching the figurine. The shadowy figure stood there again, more distinct this time. Its face was pale and hollow, its eyes sunken but filled with sorrow. It raised a hand, pointing at the box. Marcus understood. He placed the figurine back in the box and closed the lid. "Is this what you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure nodded slowly. He carried the box downstairs, his movements deliberate and reverent. The air felt lighter with each step, as though the house itself were exhaling after holding its breath for decades. Outside, Marcus dug a hole in the yard and buried the box, covering it with earth and patting it down firmly. As he stood, the whispers returned one final time, soft and grateful. "Thank you." The house seemed to sigh, its oppressive energy dissipating. Marcus looked back at the windows, half expecting to see the shadowy figure watching him. But the house was empty now, truly empty. He felt a strange sense of peace, as though he had righted a wrong that had festered for far too long. Just as he turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught his eye. In the faint glow of his car's headlights, he saw Elijah standing at the edge of the yard, his expression calm but unreadable. Marcus froze, his heart leaping into his throat. "Elijah," he called out, stepping toward him. But the boy didn't answer. Instead, he smiled faintly and pointed to the locket in Marcus's hand. Marcus looked down at it, then back up, but Elijah was gone. The yard was empty, save for the soft rustling of the wind through the grass. As Marcus drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't entirely over. The house might be at peace, but the locket still felt warm in his pocket, as though it carried a fragment of the story with it. And somewhere in the shadows of the town, secrets still lingered, waiting for the next person brave, or foolish, enough to uncover them. Driving away from the Johnson house, Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The air no longer carried the weight of the whispers, and the house itself seemed to settle into silence, but questions still swirled in his mind. Who had Elijah really been? Had the boy's spirit been guiding him all along, or had something else drawn Marcus into this dark, tangled story? He couldn't ignore the brief smile Elijah had given him before disappearing. It was as though the boy had found peace, but had Marcus. The locket rested heavily in his pocket, its warmth faint but persistent, like a heartbeat. He pulled into his driveway, sat in the car for a moment, and took it out. The small inscription, "For Elijah," gleamed faintly in the light of the street lamp. It no longer felt like a clue or a mystery. Instead, it seemed to carry the weight of a memory, a connection to everything he had uncovered. Inside his apartment, the quiet was almost startling. For the first time in days, the air didn't feel oppressive, and the shadows didn't seem alive. He set the locket on the kitchen table and poured himself a glass of water, trying to let the events of the night sink in. He thought of Elijah's grandmother, her grief, and the fear she had carried for so long. Maybe now, with the house silenced and its secrets buried, she could finally heal. The next morning, Marcus returned to the precinct. His colleagues greeted him with the usual banter, oblivious to the storm he had weathered over the past few days. He found himself wondering how to explain what had happened, or if he even should. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him, and part of him didn't want to relive it. Still, there was one person he needed to see. He drove to Elijah's grandmother's house, the locket in hand. She opened the door slowly, her eyes wary until she recognized him. "Officer," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Marcus handed her the locket without a word. Her hands trembled as she took it, and tears welled up in her eyes. "I thought this was lost forever," she whispered. She looked at him, her expression both grateful and curious. "What happened?" He hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "I found what was keeping him tied to that house," he said finally. "It's over now. He's at peace." Her shoulders sagged with relief, and she clutched the locket to her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." As he left, Marcus felt a sense of closure. He had done what he could to right a wrong that had lingered for decades. Yet, there was still a lingering sense of something unresolved, not in the house or in Elijah's story, but in himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been chosen for this, drawn into something bigger than he could understand. Over the next few weeks, Marcus tried to return to normal life. He threw himself into work, focusing on cases that felt straightforward and manageable compared to the haunting complexity of the Johnson house. But every now and then, he would catch himself glancing at the empty locket he had kept for himself, the twin to the one he had given Elijah's grandmother. It served as a reminder, not just of Elijah, but of the shadowy figure, the whispers, and the weight of the past. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, the locket felt unusually warm in his hand. He turned it over, studying its worn surface, and felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time, he didn't feel haunted. Instead, he felt connected to the boy, to his family, and even to the shadowy figure that had pointed the way. He realized that this wasn't just a story of tragedy and loss. It was a story of redemption, of broken bonds being mended, and of peace finding its way through the darkness. In the weeks and months that followed, Marcus found himself drawn to helping families who had lost loved ones. His experience with Elijah had changed him, giving him a deeper empathy and a stronger drive to bring closure to others. He never spoke of the Johnson house, the whispers, or the shadowy figure, but the lessons he had learned there stayed with him. On a quiet evening months later, Marcus drove by the Johnson house one last time. It sat there, still and silent, its windows dark, but no longer menacing. He parked the car and stepped out, standing on the sidewalk as the wind rustled through the overgrown grass. The house felt different now, no longer alive with restless energy, but resting, like a weary soul finally at peace. As he turned to leave, he thought he saw a flicker of movement in one of the upstairs windows. For a moment, he froze, his heart pounding. But when he looked again, it was gone. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Goodbye, Elijah," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. As he drove away, the house disappeared in his rearview mirror, fading into the past where it belonged. Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. He didn't know if he would ever fully understand what had happened or why he had been drawn into it, but he knew one thing for certain: he had made a difference, and that was enough. Life moved on, as it always does, but the memory of Elijah and the Johnson house stayed with Marcus in quiet moments. It wasn't a burden or a haunting. It was a reminder of the strength found in confronting darkness, the connections that transcend time, and the peace that comes when long-buried truths are finally brought to light.